The sun crests the jagged spine of the Simeon Mountains, bleeding light across a landscape that has remained indifferent to the passage of empires. Here, at the edge of the clouds, the air is thin, sharp, and carries the silence of centuries. Nestled into the sheer rock face, the monastery stands as a jagged extension of the mountain itself, its stone walls weathered by relentless winds. There is no road leading to this threshold, only the steep, unforgiving paths carved by those who came before. Below, the valleys are still drowned in deep, indigo shadow, but the highest peaks are already burning with the first gold of morning. This is a place defined by its distance from the world below, a fortress of solitude where the horizon offers no distraction. The wind howls through the mountain passes with a hollow, rhythmic intensity, scouring the ancient masonry until it glows. The monastery reveals its singular purpose: to hold, to guard, and to remain, while the world beyond continues its restless evolution. Inside the stone chamber, the temperature drops, turning breath into thin gray mist. The monk kneels on the uneven floor, his knees pressing into the cold, unyielding rock. He does not move until the light from the narrow window hits the center of the wooden lectern. He reaches out, his hands steady, and touches the edge of the vellum. The material is dry, brittle, and heavy with the weight of centuries. He turns the page, the sound of parchment against parchment echoing like a dry leaf skittering across stone. His finger, calloused and mapped with deep lines, traces a single column of Ge'ez script. The ink is not black, but a deep, oxidized brown, shimmering faintly as the morning light shifts across the surface. He pauses, his gaze fixed on the characters, his breathing slowing to match the rhythm of the room. There is no haste in his movements. He is a link in a chain that stretches back to the era of King Ezana, a silent custodian of a memory that refuses to fade. He turns another page, his touch light, almost reverent, ensuring the fragile edges do not tear. The scent of beeswax and ancient cured skin hangs heavy in the air. This is not merely a book, it is a survivor. While the world beyond these peaks spent centuries in a frantic, shifting debate over which texts belonged in the Canon, this library remained silent, steady, and complete. The manuscript rests on the lectern, its heavy leather binding scarred by time, yet holding its shape with an iron-willed permanence. It has outlasted the rise and fall of empires, the burning of great archives, and the systematic erasure of entire spiritual lineages. Outside, the world is defined by change, by the constant pressure to categorize, streamline, and define the boundaries of truth. But here, the air is thick with the scent of old parchment and beeswax, a stagnant, protected atmosphere where time has no currency. The manuscript does not care for the printing presses that standardize the faith elsewhere. It does not acknowledge the reformers who sought to strip away the ancient accounts. It simply exists, a defiant, physical anchor in a sea of historical revision. It is a monument to what remains when the noise of history finally dies down. The monk leans closer, his calloused finger beginning to trace a precise line of Ge'ez script. The movement is practiced, a slow dance of recognition across the weathered page. He follows the ink, his eyes tracking the ancient curves that have been read by generations of guardians before him. Outside, the wind begins to howl, a sharp, piercing sound that tears through the mountain pass, rattling the stone masonry of the monastery walls. It is a violent, restless noise. Yet inside the chamber, the air remains unnervingly still. The monk does not look up. He does not flinch. He is anchored by the weight of his duty, a silent observer in a lineage that traces its origin back to the time of King Ezana. For centuries, this specific line of guardians has stood in this exact spot, holding the same pages, breathing the same thin, high-altitude air. He is not merely a reader. He is the latest link in a chain that has refused to break. He shifts his weight and continues to read. The monk turns the page, his eyes settling on the title of the work, It is the Book of Enoch. The ink here is sharp, clear, and defiant. This text once circulated widely in the early Christian world, a shared vision of the divine that spanned continents. Yet, as the centuries turned and printing presses began to standardize the faith, this account vanished from the Western consciousness. It was not destroyed, but it was set aside, relegated to the margins of history. The monk runs his hand over the vellum, feeling the weight of the words that the rest of the world had decided to leave behind. He knows the history of this manuscript is a puzzle. While the West moved toward a curated, singular version of Scripture, this library remained a vault for the complex and the ancient. The irony is profound. The text was never truly lost, yet for generations, it was treated as if it had never existed. He is not just reading a book, he is guarding a secret that the rest of the world is only beginning to realize is missing. The monk pauses, his gaze drifting from the vellum to the stone wall. He considers the world beyond these mountains, where the 16th century brought a different kind of fire. Reformers across Europe began to sort, to prune, and to define the boundaries of what was permitted. They sought a singular, streamlined path, a way to categorize the divine into a more rigid, manageable structure. He imagines them in their cold, stone rooms, holding their pens, deciding which voices would remain and which would be silenced. It was an act of narrowing, a deliberate choice to strip away the complex, the ancient, and the challenging. Where the Ethiopian Church saw a living, breathing tapestry of accounts, the Reformers saw only clutter that needed to be cleared. They were building a fence around the faith, and in doing so, they inadvertently created a void. The monk touches the page again, feeling the texture of the ink. He realizes that the silence of the library is a direct response to that historical shift, a quiet, stubborn refusal to let the boundaries of the faith be drawn. The monk turns a page, his thumb brushing against the ink of the deuterocanonical books. He considers the reformers across the sea. They were not merely translating, they were pruning. They sought to strip away the layers of the ancient world, discarding anything that did not fit their new, rigid definition of Scripture. It was an act of intellectual surgery, intended to leave only a clean, manageable core. He traces the lines of a text that would have been burned or buried in those distant European libraries. For the reformers, these books were clutter, obstacles to a standardized faith. They wanted a Bible that could be measured, categorized, and controlled. But the monk knows that by removing these voices, they were not just simplifying the text, they were hollowing out the divine experience. The world they were building was flatter, stripped of the strange, cosmic, and mystical elements that had defined the early church. He stares at the vellum, realizing that the true Scripture they sought was a curated illusion. Every page he guards is a testament to what was lost. But here, in the high, thin air of the Simeon Range, the mandate never arrived. The decree of the reformers was a sound that died long before it could climb these granite slopes. The monk turns to a different shelf, his hand hovering over the heavy, weathered bindings of the Book of Jubilees. There was no pruning here. No committee of scholars sat in judgment of these pages. The Ethiopian Church continued to read the accounts of the ancestors and the chronicles of Maccabean exactly as they had for centuries. To the monk, these are not relics of a forgotten past. They are the pulse of his daily life. He reads a passage aloud, his voice low and steady against the stone walls, filling the chamber with words that the West had long since labeled as extraneous. The library is not a tomb of lost things, but a sanctuary of the persistent, where the divine is still encountered in its full, untamed complexity. The irony sits heavy in the room, sharper than the mountain air. Scholars in the West spent centuries mourning the missing books, hunting for fragments in dust-choked archives, convinced they had vanished into the ether. They spoke of these texts as if they were ghosts, long dead and buried by time. The monk looks at the shelf, his hand resting on the spine of a volume that the world below claimed did not exist. They were never lost. They were simply kept. They were held in the hands of those whom the West would later categorize as other. a people deemed too distant or too different to be part of the grand narrative. The realization is a cold, hard fact. While the reformers drew their lines and defined their boundaries, the monks of these mountains were reading the very words the West insisted were gone. The books were not hidden, they were guarded. They were part of a living, breathing tradition that refused to be silenced by the shifting tides of European theology. The monk traces the edge of the leather binding, feeling the texture of a history that contradicts the entire Western canon. The lost wisdom was never absent. The timeline of these mountains defies the narrative of the world below. Long before the first ships crossed the Atlantic, and centuries before the concept of race was forged as a tool for profit, this monastery was a center of rigorous study. The monk walks to the narrow stone window, looking out over the jagged peaks. He does not see a continent waiting to be defined by others. He sees an ancient, unbroken chain of thought. While European powers were still centuries away from inventing the hierarchies that would justify the commodification of human life, the scholars here were already debating the celestial journeys of Enoch. They were already mapping the cosmic drama of the Watchers. This was not a primitive silence. It was a vibrant, intellectual landscape. The monk touches the cold stone of the sill, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He knows that the history taught in the West, the one that places Africa outside the history of ideas, is a recent, manufactured fiction. The texts he guards were already old. The world outside the monastery walls began to change, not through faith, but through the ledger. In the 17th century, the expansion of global trade demanded a new architecture of control. The invention of race was not a discovery of biology. It was an economic necessity. It was a system designed to turn living human beings into property, a mechanism to justify the extraction of labor for profit. The monk closes the heavy ledger, the sound sharp against the stone. He moves to the center of the room, away from the window, as if the air itself has grown colder. This was the era when the West began to dress its greed in the borrowed robes of science. They needed a hierarchy to stabilize their markets, a way to define some lives as inferior to ensure the flow of capital remained uninterrupted. The logic of the market had begun to override the logic of the soul, and the history of the world was being rewritten to serve the interests of the few. The logic of the ledger required a fundamental shift in perception. To turn a human being into property, the architects of the new trade had to strip away the soul and replace it with a label. They claimed an inferior nature for the people they sought to enslave, a calculated lie designed to bypass the moral weight of their actions. The monk traces a line of ancient ink, his finger pausing over a passage describing the equality of all spirits before the divine. He looks up, the stone walls of the monastery offering no protection from the cold reality of this history. Outside, the wind shifts, but inside, the silence is absolute. This was the birth of a brutal hierarchy. By defining entire groups as inherently lesser, the systems of the West transformed living, breathing people into mere units of production. It was a cold, mechanical process, stripped of all humanity. The monk stands, his movements deliberate and slow, as he contemplates the distance between these pages and the world. He sees the disconnect clearly. While the monastery preserved a tradition that recognized the complexity of the human experience, the emerging global market was busy constructing a cage of inferiority. The monk closes the book, the heavy sound echoing against the stone, marking the end of a thought that the world below was desperate to forget. The system needed a mask. To sustain the commodification of human life, the architects of the new order reached for a tool they could claim was objective: science. They dressed their economic greed in the borrowed robes of biology, turning the pursuit of profit into a pursuit of natural law. The monk runs his thumb over the vellum, feeling the rough, authentic grain of the page. It is a stark contrast to the smooth, manufactured surface of the ideologies emerging in the West. Those distant thinkers were busy drafting taxonomies, categorizing humanity into rigid tiers to ensure the machinery of trade never stalled. It was a calculated deception. By framing their exploitation as a discovery of nature, they stripped away the moral weight of their actions, replacing it with the cold, sterile language of classification. The monk stands in the center of the chamber, the silence of the mountains pressing against the stone. He understands that this was not a search for truth, but a search for justification. The logic was simple. If they could define a person as a specimen rather than a spirit, the ledger would always balance. He looks toward the narrow window, where the light cuts through the dust. The world below was building a prison of categories, a structure of intellectual theft designed to hide the blood on their hands. He turns back to the shelf, his movements steady and deliberate. While the West labored to build its hierarchies, the Ethiopian Church held to a different lens. It was not a structure of tiers, but a map of the cosmos. The monk walks to the stone ledge, his boots clicking against the floor. He looks out at the jagged peaks, seeing a world that refused to be categorized by the narrow logic of the ledger. In the West, they were drawing lines, defining the boundaries of true humanity to serve the demands of profit. But here, the tradition remained open, recognizing a complexity that the new global market was desperate to erase. The monk picks up a small, weathered stone from the sill, turning it over in his palm. It is heavy, irregular, and real, a physical rejection of the sterile labels being printed in distant cities. The ideological collision is silent but absolute. One side seeks to shrink the world into property. The other seeks to expand it into mystery. He feels the weight of this divide. The Western project is a cage of intellectual theft, designed to justify the commodification of the soul. In contrast, the manuscript, in his care, offers a vision of humanity linked to the divine. He knows that the truth preserved in these mountains is an obstacle to the world below. The monk turns back to the vellum, his calloused fingers tracing the dense, angular gaze script. The ink is dark, almost vibrating against the pale, aged skin of the page. He is no longer reading history. He is reading the architecture of the heavens. The text begins to shift, moving away from the mundane concerns of kings and reformers, into the terrifying, expansive drama of the Watchers. These were beings of light and fire who descended to the earth, their presence shattering the boundaries between the celestial and the mortal. The monk pauses, his breath hitching in the cold air. He reads of forbidden knowledge passed to humanity, of secrets stolen from the stars, and of the resulting chaos that bled into the foundations of the world. The scale of the story expands, the stone walls of the monastery seeming to dissolve into the vast, turbulent cosmos, described by Enoch. He sees the Nephilim, the progeny of this divine transgression, and the world spiraling into a darkness that no human ledger could ever account for. This is not a story of property or profit. It is a story of cosmic order and the catastrophic cost of crossing the line. The air in the chamber grows heavy, charged with the weight of these ancient, celestial events. The monk feels the shift in his own pulse, a rhythm matching the unfolding apocalypse on the page. The supernatural is no longer a distant concept. The monk pauses, his finger hovering over the ink. He realizes the text is not just a record of the heavens. It is a mirror held up to the world below. Every line of Enoch reflects the very transgressions that define the history of empires. The Watchers who crossed the line, the knowledge they stole, the chaos they unleashed. It is all a reflection of the greed that would later attempt to define humanity as property. He traces the shape of the letters, feeling the sharp, cold irony of it. The reformers in the West did not lose these books. They feared them. They sought to curate a version of the divine that would not challenge their own earthly hierarchies. But the mirror remains unbroken. The monk turns the page, the sound of dry parchment scraping against stone, echoing like a warning. He sees the reflection of his own era in the ancient words, a cycle of power and corruption that the text exposes with brutal clarity. The air in the chamber feels thin, electric with the weight of the secrets he is about to uncover. He is no longer just a guardian of a book. He is a witness to the truth. He takes a long, steadying breath, his hands trembling slightly as he prepares to read the final, forbidden accounts. The anticipation is absolute. The monk finds the passage. It is brief, almost a footnote in the ancient scrolls. Enoch, the seventh from Adam, walked with God, and then he was gone. No death, no grave, no finality, just a sudden, absolute erasure from the mortal plane. The monk stares at the ink, the silence of the room deepening as he processes the void left behind. But the text does not stop there. The parchment seems to pulse under his touch, the ink bleeding into new, jagged shapes. The narrative snaps. The quiet, measured tone of Genesis dissolves, replaced by a violent, rushing current of imagery. The monk gasps as the ceiling of the chamber seems to tear open, revealing a sky that burns with colors he has no names for. This is the vision. It is no longer a story of a man walking. It is a story of the heavens collapsing. The apocalyptic scale hits him like a physical blow, the air in the room vibrating with the sound of unseen wings and grinding celestial gears. The monk grips the edge of the table, his knuckles white, as the first wave of the apocalypse crashes over him, pulling him deep into the heart of the forbidden revelation. The sky above the monastery does not just open, it fractures. A jagged, blinding light cuts through the firmament, and the air turns to static. They are coming down, not as spirits, but as a physical force that bends the light and warps the gravity of the mountain pass. The monk watches as the clouds are shredded by the sheer velocity of their descent. These are the Watchers. Their forms are not human, but towering, shifting masses of brilliance and shadow that defy the laws of the natural world. Each impact as they touch the earth sends a shockwave through the stone floor, vibrating up through the monk's boots and into his very bones. The monastery walls groan under the pressure of their presence. The atmosphere is thick with the smell of ozone and scorched earth. They move with a terrifying, calculated grace, their eyes scanning the landscape as if they are measuring the world for a harvest. The monk stands frozen, his hands pressed against the stone, feeling the entire mountain tremble beneath the weight of their arrival. The world has changed forever. The Watchers do not speak. They touch. Their fingers, long and cold as mountain ice, press against the foreheads of the first men they encounter. The transfer is instant. It is not a lesson. It is an intrusion. Secrets of the stars, the geometry of the heavens, and the hidden properties of the earth flood into human consciousness. The monk watches as the people of the valley collapse, their eyes rolling back, their minds expanding until they scream. They learn to forge metal into blades that can cut through stone. They learn the alchemy of poisons that leave no trace. They learn the movements of the planets to predict the rise and fall of empires. This is the forbidden knowledge. It is heavy, jagged, and sharp. It burns through the simplicity of their lives, replacing wonder with a desperate, clawing ambition. The air in the valley thickens with the smell of molten iron and burnt sage. Every secret is a weight, and every secret is a weapon. The people stand, their movements jerky and unnatural, their hands already reaching for the tools of their own destruction. The knowledge has taken root. It is a parasite of the mind, and it is spreading faster than fire in dry grass. The world is no longer a place of quiet growth. It is a laboratory of chaos. The transgression does not stop at the mind. It descends into the flesh. The Watchers move among the people, their towering forms casting long, distorted shadows that swallow the light of the sun. They take what they desire, and the earth itself seems to recoil from the contact. The union is a violation of every law written in the stars. Within weeks, the first of the Nephilim emerge. They are not born. They are forged in a crucible of divine power and mortal frailty. They grow with a terrifying, unnatural speed, their limbs thickening into pillars of corded muscle, their height stretching toward the canopy of the trees. They do not walk. They stalk. They do not eat. They consume. The ground trembles under their heavy, rhythmic tread. Each step leaves a crater in the soft soil of the valley. They are giants, their skin marked by the strange, glowing geometry of their fathers. The people who once tilled the earth now cower in the shade of these colossal figures. The age of men has ended. The age of the giants has begun. The sky itself begins to warp. Where the atmosphere once held a steady rhythmic pulse, it now shudders under the weight of the transgression. The stars, once fixed in their ancient, silent orbits, drift out of alignment, their light flickering like a dying flame. This is the cost of the boundary crossing. The heavens are no longer a distant, untouchable canopy. They are bleeding into the earth. Monxi's universe bend. Mountains crack, not from tectonic force, but from the sheer pressure of the divine intrusion. Rivers reverse their flow, surging upward toward the peaks. The air grows thin, charged with the ozone of a dying reality. This is not merely a story of giants. It is the record of a cosmic fracture. The horizon glows with a bruised, unnatural violet, casting long, jagged shadows that stretch across the world. Every law of nature is being rewritten in real time. The earth groans, a deep, resonant sound that vibrates through the stone walls. The world is a mirror of the heavens, and both are shattering. While the West began to prune its scriptures, seeking a sterile and uniform faith, the highlands of Ethiopia held the line. They did not seek to simplify the divine. They did not strip away the accounts of the Watchers or the celestial journeys of Enoch to fit a narrow, human-defined canon. Instead, they preserved the complexity. The manuscript in the monk's hands is a testament to this refusal. It is a living, breathing archive of a world where the mystical and the physical are inextricably linked. The Western reformers sought to categorize, to define, and to draw hard lines around what was considered true. They viewed the world through a lens of exclusion. But here, in the cold stone of the monastery, the tradition remained expansive. The monk turns a page, his finger tracing the ancient gaze characters. He is not reading a static text. He is engaging with a cosmic drama that refuses to be tamed. The contrast is absolute. The parchment feels heavy, dense, with the weight of centuries. A physical anchor to a reality that the rest of the world has long since tried to forget. The monk stares at the final page. The ink seems to pulse, a rhythmic flicker that mirrors the cosmic fracture he has been witnessing. He breathes in, the scent of beeswax and ancient dust filling his lungs, grounding him as the vision recedes. The weight of the parchment is immense, a physical manifestation of a history that refused to be silenced. He shifts his grip. His calloused fingers press against the heavy leather cover. He does not rush. He aligns the edges of the vellum, the dry rustle of the pages sounding like dead leaves in the quiet room. Then, he brings the two sides together. The leather binding meets the stone-cold table with a sharp, definitive crack. The sound is not merely a noise, it is a physical jolt that travels through the floor and up into his bones. It echoes against the monastery walls, bouncing off the damp masonry and dying away. The vision is severed. The cosmic drama is tucked away, compressed into the dark, silent space between the covers. The monk remains still, his hands cupped around the leather-bound volume, as if it were a living coal. The silence of the chamber is no longer empty. It is pressurized, thick with the weight of the words he has just finished reading. He stands, his knees popping in the quiet, and turns toward the shadows that cling to the back wall. Every step is measured, deliberate, and slow. He does not look back at the table. He keeps his gaze fixed on the uneven stone masonry ahead. His fingers trace the spine of the book, feeling the cracked texture of the hide and the rough hand-stitched seams. He reaches the niche, a narrow, dark cavity, carved directly into the mountain rock. It is a space designed for concealment, not display. He slides the manuscript into the opening, his palms lingering against the cover for a heartbeat longer than necessary. The fit is precise, the book vanishing into the gloom of the stone. He pulls his hands away, leaving the space empty. The monk turns his back on the niche. The space feels hollow now, the weight of the manuscript replaced by a sudden, sharp lightness in his hands. He walks across the stone floor, his footsteps rhythmic and soft against the uneven rock. Each stride pulls him further from the sanctuary of the shadows. He moves toward the source of the day, a jagged aperture in the monastery wall that frames the mountain pass beyond. The air grows cooler as he nears the opening, carrying the scent of pine and thin, high-altitude wind. He pauses at the threshold, his hand brushing the rough masonry of the doorframe. The contrast is jarring. Behind him, the chamber remains locked in a stillness that has persisted for centuries. Before him, the sun is high, casting a blinding white glare across the stone courtyard. He steps forward, crossing the line where the darkness ends and the world begins. The light hits his face, intense and unforgiving, washing away the dimness of the archive. He stands at the edge of the precipice, looking out over the vast, rugged landscape. The wind catches his breath, pulling it out into the open air. Thousands of miles from the mountain ridge, the air is not thin or cold. It is recycled and dry. In quiet, windowless rooms, researchers sit hunched over illuminated screens and digitized records. They are tracing the same lines of text the monk just touched, but their hands tremble for a different reason. A realization ripples through the academic community. Quiet at first, then undeniable. The Bible they have studied is not the complete record. The shock is physical. It manifests in the sudden stillness of a researcher who stops mid-sentence, the dropping of a pen. They are discovering the gaps where the Book of Enoch and the accounts of the Watchers were excised, smoothed over, and forgotten. The maps they use to navigate their history are suddenly revealed to be incomplete. They see a deliberate silence. The realization is a slow burning fire, consuming the certainty of their past, leaving them to stare at the blank spaces. High in the Simeon range, the monk remains still. He does not hear the frantic pace of researchers halfway across the globe, nor does he feel the tremors of their crumbling certainties. He only knows the mountain. He leans against the weathered stone of the monastery, feeling the cold, rough surface bite into his palms. It is a solid, unyielding reality. Behind him, the manuscript rests in its niche, a silent witness to the centuries that have passed since the time of King Ezana. The wind shifts, carrying the sharp, clean scent of snow from the peaks above. He breathes it in, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of the high altitude. There is no urgency here, only the quiet, heavy weight of endurance. The words remain. They have survived the rise and fall of empires, the shifting tides of dogma, and the deliberate erasures of men who sought to define the divine by what they could exclude. He stands as a sentinel, watching the shadows stretch across the valley, knowing the source of the story has never moved. The monk steps out from the stone threshold, his eyes adjusting to the blinding clarity of the high-altitude sun. Below him, the valley floor is a tapestry of shifting light and shadow, vast and indifferent to the debates of men. He does not look back at the manuscript. He does not need to. The words are etched into the mountain itself, as immutable as the granite cliffs that cradle this sanctuary. He stands on the edge of the precipice, the wind whipping against his face. Thousands of miles away, the scholars are still turning their pages, still tracing the gaps, still feeling the cold shock of a history rewritten. But here, there is only the silence of the peaks and the weight of what was kept. He watches a hawk circle the thermal currents. The story he guards is not a relic. It is a mirror. It forces a confrontation with the architects of history. As the light begins to fade, casting long, reaching fingers across the stone, the question remains: why was the story changed? The monk turns and walks toward the monastery wall, leaving the question for the world below to answer. The silence is a demand for truth.